I'm Effie Parks. Welcome to Once Upon a Gene, the podcast. This is a place I created for us to connect and share the stories of our not-so-typical lives. Raising kids who are born with rare genetic syndromes and other types of disabilities can feel pretty isolating. What I know for sure is that when we can hear the triumphs and challenges from others who get it, we can find a lot more laughter, a lot more hope, and feel a lot less alone. I believe there are some magical healing powers that can happen for all of us through sharing our stories, and I'll take all the help I can get.
Once Upon a Gene is proud to be part of Bloodstream Media. Living in a family affected by rare and chronic illness can be isolating, and sometimes the best medicine is connecting to the voices of people who share your experience. This is why Bloodstream Media produces podcasts, blogs, and other forms of content for patients, families, and clinicians impacted by rare and chronic diseases. Visit bloodstreammedia.com to learn more.
Hello, my Once Upon a Genies. Thank you for being here. I'm your host, Effie Parks, mom to my CT and NB1 buddy Ford, and I'm happy to be here to help share the stories, the important stories of those on this crusade. We all have different paths. Please know that yours is important, and do not be intimidated. If you can figure out what you're good at and do something, it all matters, and it all counts. If you need some ideas, please shoot me a message. I'm full of them. Y'all know I love a rad dad, and I have another great one for you today. He's a surgeon in Orange County, California, and he has a gorgeous family. One of his sons has a devastating disease called KCNT1-related epilepsy. It's a rare infant onset seizure disorder. He serves as president and co-founder of the organization, and he's the director of clinical medicine for the foundation. He uses his gifts as a physician to advocate, and he has a unique position to speak the language. So he's so down to earth, and he's doing incredible work to help get a treatment to these kids, which, as you know, helps us all in this community one way or another. I'm only sorry I didn't get to record all of the questions I had for him about the show Nip Tuck. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Justin West. Hi, Justin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yep, I'm really looking forward to it. I had the honor of actually meeting you in person for a moment at the table when we were at the SYNGAP Research Conference together. So that was very cool to have your face to your episode beforehand, which doesn't usually happen in that order.
That's right. Yeah, no, it was, let's not throw out the word honor. I mean, I would say the honor was it's the opposite, right? It was an honor for me. I mean, you've been a leader in this community, and I think you've done an amazing job sharing, your stories and other patient stories, which is a massive benefit for all of us in this community. And then the part you're leaving out is that after that, we also went out to some sort of honky-tonk thing where there's a lot of dancing going on. So it wasn't just dinner at SYNGAP. A lot of us ended up getting dragged out by people like you who are highly motivated leaders, both socially and in the rare disease world.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Yes, there was line dancing. Yes.
There was.
And Mike was shockingly good at it too.
Oh, he's good at everything. Don't act shocked. And his baseline rhythm isn't excellent, but he's good at following direction and he learns quickly. So
that's true. He's a very good listener.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so funny. Well, thank you for saying that, Justin. That really means a lot to me. And that's my goal, is to help lift all of our patient groups. So thank you so much. First of all, your family is absolutely stunning. I love your family photo, those beautiful kids of yours and your wife. I'd like to learn about them and Andrew specifically.
Yeah. My wife and I met in medical school many years ago in Philadelphia. We were next door neighbors. And so we met the first day and started becoming friends. And over time, that turned into a relationship, and we ended up getting engaged the day before the match. So she knew she was going to Georgetown for ophthalmology, and I was going to open up my letter the next day and find out where I was going to spend the next 6 years. And fortunately, it worked out that we ended up in the same place at Georgetown. We put off having kids. We were working really hard back then. I was working 120-hour weeks, sometimes 140-hour weeks, and she was putting in a lot of really bad hours. And so like a lot of people in our position, we delayed having kids. We wanted to be present for them, and we wanted to have financial resources to be able to take care of them. So, we started late. By the time we had our first child, Carolyn, I was right around 40. And we had struggled to have kids. It didn't come easily. We went through IVF and some other approaches to try to have our first child. And so we started late, which of course presents risks for moms and babies and creates some challenges. But Carolyn came and she was, really a healthy kid and precocious. She's a total gem, totally adore her. And then our second son, Colin, came a couple of years later. And Colin's a precocious little kid and super smart, bright, very funny little personality. And then Andrew came along about 2 years after that. So they're now 9, 7, and 5. When Andrew was born, everything was totally normal. We had a normal pregnancy and, Andrew was delivered and he was this beautiful, shiny baby and had a really loud cry and he was pink and perfect. And the first few months were, totally normal. He was hitting little mini milestones that babies are expected to hit. And, we struggled to figure out how we're going to manage, 3 kids under the age of 5. But, it was fun. And looking back at the time, I guess it was actually really easy compared to what it's become. And then Andrew's kind of journey into epilepsy began. So I was at work. Lisa had not returned to work yet at this point. He was about 3.5 months old, and Lisa sent me a text with a video attachment saying, "What do you think this is?" And I looked at it, and I couldn't really see anything. And I said, "I'm not really sure. I don't think it's anything. He's a baby, and maybe he's moving a little spasmodically." I mean, it was a really subtle little foot flicker. But she posted it online in a Facebook group for women physicians in Orange County, where we're from. And within an hour, an epileptologist got on and said, "That's a seizure. You need to take him to Children's Hospital of Orange County." So we went, and this journey kind of began. So I've been talking a lot. If you want to ask questions, go for it. Otherwise, I can just keep talking for the next 2 weeks straight, probably.
No, I'm never going to stop you when you're talking. It's really thorough and it follows the timeline of such an important event. And also just how lucky you were to be in that Facebook group, because it makes me go, wow, I wonder how much longer it would have taken for you to find out that Andrew was beginning to have these seizures if she wasn't a part of that Facebook group. I mean, I think you have to call the doctor, you have to go to the pediatrician, then you have to go to the specialist, then like that stuff it makes me ill to think about the timeline that could have happened even then for Andrew.
Absolutely. And, I guess, so her response to that was, it drove us to take him into the emergency room. And of course, when we got there, he wasn't having any seizures. And even if he had it, it was so subtle. I'm not sure anybody really would have, it was almost imperceptible. And it was happening, I think we just saw the one at the time. So they did a full seizure workup, which as 2 surgeons was kind of hard to watch. ER doctors manipulate your child in a way that's maybe different from a procedural point of view as how surgeons do things in the operating room. But, not going from total control, when you're in the OR as a surgeon, you run that room, and to go from being a parent who has no influence and doesn't know anything about what's being done, it's a really awful feeling. But, they did this workup and said, well, we'll get some labs, and everything at the time seemed very normal. They said, we'll dial you in to see an epileptologist as an outpatient. And we were sent home, which at the time seemed totally fine. I mean, it was just this tiny little thing. And I wouldn't say we were minimizing it, but it seemed very manageable in the moment. So between, I think, that ER discharge and our neurology visit, the foot flicker started to happen a little bit more often. And it got to the point where even I could recognize that it was going on. It wasn't, it became a less and less subtle. This time you have to bear in mind in retrospect, I mean, it all kind of blends together because it was a really horrific time of our lives. But the big picture evolution was that it went from these very subtle foot flicks to more distinct movements of his leg. And it went from happening once or twice a day to, 6 times and then a dozen times. And at some point it was happening 50 times a day. So Andrew eventually, he got admitted to Children's Orange County and started on one anti-epileptic drug and then another and then another. And, unfortunately, our kids, kids with our disease are resistant to pretty much every medication out there. It's one of the hallmarks is this, they're resistant to drugs. But I would say his first year, he ended up spending probably 100 days of his first year of life in different hospitals throughout Southern California. So, first it was CHOC and then UCLA and then CHLA. And I think largely because we were 2 desperate parents who thought, well, it couldn't possibly be the disease, it's the team that's failing him. And so we would look for alternative answers at different hospitals. But what we found is that everybody had essentially the same experience. We still didn't really have a working diagnosis for what was causing it. He had had an MRI and the way they read that was that it looked like there was a suggestion of a small area of his brain that might be leading to these seizures. So we were told, well, if that's the case, he'll eventually have a surgery one day, maybe when he's closer to 2, and they'll take out this little area, but that'll fix the problem. And maybe he'll have a tiny limp, but he'll be a totally normal child. So I started focusing on finding the best pediatric neurosurgeon in the coury, made a bunch of phone calls to friends and colleagues in that world, and we got some names and started having remote phone consults, and we had a plan. But the seizures kept getting worse and worse and worse, and eventually somebody on our local team at Children's Hospital said, there might be a genetic cause here, and there was some infighting about whether that made any sense. But ultimately, they ordered a panel test, and I don't know what it was. A couple weeks later, we get the result. I just finished a surgery. It was, I don't know, 6 o'clock at night, and I was in the recovery room writing a note about what I had just done, and I got a call from our main epileptologist at CHLA, actually, and he said, we got the genetic testing report back. I said, okay, and he said, well, this is what your kid has. He's got a mutation in the KCNT1 gene. And I said, okay, well, what's that mean to us? And he said, well, it's good news. And I said, well, okay, why is it good news? What's it going to change? He said, oh, it's not going to change anything. We don't have a treatment for it, but at least we know what we're dealing with. And this epileptologist I absolutely adore. When we found out for the first time we were going to see him, I had reached out to my mother's cousin, who at one point had been the head of adult neurology and epilepsy at one of the Harvard hospitals. And he found out we were seeing this gentleman and said, I would sell my house to have this person take care of my kids. So we felt really comfortable with him, and he is a gem of a human. But the context of that comment didn't really resonate that well, because to me, if you've got an untreatable disease, it's hard to kind of, for me, qualify it as good news. And I asked, I said, well, is there any research? Was there anything going on? And he threw out the word patch clamp testing, and that meant nothing to me at the time, and still doesn't mean a ton to me. But he threw out, that was about the only term he threw out, but he said there's no treatment that's underway anytime soon for this disease, and maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll have something. And then I went home and talked to my wife about it, and we started Googling this mutation, and the first sentence of every article ever written about it refers to this devastating or catastrophic diagnosis. And then you learn that your kid is never going to walk and is never going to talk and has a 20% chance of dying by age 5, and they're not going to respond to any seizure medications, and your kid will basically be a 4-month-old for the rest of his or her life. And that was probably the most painful 24 hours of our lives, I would say, because you've got this horrible disease. You essentially realize you've lost your child and nothing's going on that's going to make it better. And so we went into a pretty dark space for the next year.
Yeah. Ugh, it makes me emotional. That diagnosis day, especially when it's maybe delivered not super well at the time, and not necessarily for lack of anything good in a human, but, they accomplished their job. But what it does to a family is so different. I would never say that any disease is more profound than the other, but there is an urgency in diseases like KCNT1 that are undeniable truths, and having catastrophic forms of epilepsy and so on. I know there wasn't a patient organization started yet, but you actually did have several patients at the time. So what was it that happened? And was it within that first year, when you were sort of grappling with the potential future and lifespan of Andrew, was it that you decided to start this advocacy group?
Well, I actually didn't start the group that I'm part of. So the first year was really living in this dark space and climbing all over clinicaltrials.gov and just seeing if there's anything out there. And the summary was that there was nothing that we could find. We did reach out to programs like Boston Children, some other places, and we started sending blood samples to people who had written papers about KCNT1 and where there seemed to be some research. But we didn't at the time start a foundation. And then a year into his diagnosis, when we were just kind of coming out of the fog, my brother was diagnosed with brain cancer. And so I was now dealing with 2 different diseases that have really catastrophic outcomes. And so I got a little diverted with that. But the foundation was started by one of the other fathers in our group who's out on the East Coast. He started the foundation, and it had an initial meeting with families and some of the researchers. And it had come across our radar. My wife flew out to go attend the meeting and meet some of the key people. And at the time, by that point, we were a year in, and we had started having conversations in our family about starting a foundation. And we were trying to figure out, should we do it should it be a family support organization? Should it be about drug discovery? Should it be about research? And for us, I think that the conclusion was it should really be translational. We wanted a drug and we wanted to push it as fast as possible. So rather than having two competing foundations, which I think that we sometimes see in our world, I started having conversations with Seth Greenblatt, who had started the foundation, said, we've been thinking about doing this. Would it make more sense to partner and work together as opposed to have two different organizations? And ultimately, that's the decision that we came to, was to work together. And then over the period of a couple of years, we took that early phase foundation and kind of brought some more constructive elements to it. We started our science advisory board and we started having formal communications with everybody who is researching KCNT1. And we established relationships with all the clinicians who are treating KCNT1 patients. And we started patient registry and we started a number of initiatives, but I won't take credit for starting it. I came in and sort of helped build what was there in conjunction with this other family because it seemed like the most productive way to get treatments to Andrew and other kids in our community.
Actually, right after you started talking, I do remember that there was someone who had started it and you came in and just helped it flourish, right? So that was just another great mind coming on board and another motivated parent who just helped push things further.
Yeah, and I think that's, it felt like a good way of doing things. I mean, you know how it is. It's a rare disease. It's a lonely road. And most of us aren't sitting around doing nothing, waiting for a diagnosis like this to happen and then making a job out of it. Most of us are, we're taking care of other kids and we're working for a living and caring for our families. And so it's hard to have the bandwidth to take on a project of this nature solo. And so partnering, number one, emotionally, it was nice to have another father or parent of any kind who is going through the same thing. It felt less lonely to be able to share those experiences together and then to advocate together, to be able to feed off of each other, I think was important. And then ultimately we brought in a third parent to the group to round things out and add some more brain power. And then we were lucky enough to have Sarah Drizzling, my aunt, get involved and become a powerhouse executive director. So, we've built a really, I think, effective team over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, you've moved pretty quickly for sure. Speaking of kind of like the isolation, especially in the dad world, I would wonder if you would speak on that a little deeper or I'm curious as like a clinician, was it hard? I know for me as a parent, it's hard for me to relate to other parents now, unless I like really try. Totally. But I wonder as a clinician, did that also kind of get a little disconnected? Like, do you feel as a physician or a surgeon and now as a rare disease dad that it's harder to connect to your colleagues in a way? Or have you found that they've really jumped on board to kind of show up?
There are so many issues in what you just brought up there. We could talk about all this for an hour. So I guess like with regards to being a physician, I'm a surgeon and surgeons tend to be problem solvers, right? Somebody comes in bleeding, you stop the bleeding. Somebody has cancer, you remove the cancer. We like to find really, definitive, quick solutions. We tend to move fast and, we're not treating diseases over a 40-year time period. We remove things, we do things. In some ways, it's a fairly simple problem solving type of job. I think that in terms of how Andrew's disease has impacted me, I would say, for years I took care of mostly breast cancer patients and I would go through that emotional journey, with 3 new patients, let's say a day, and kind of take on that responsibility emotionally of managing that beyond just the technical side of taking care of a cancer patient. And it's a big responsibility. You live this diagnosis over and over and over again and try to shepherd them through that as well as you can. I think that once Andrew was diagnosed, I kind of quickly realized that I could not be that kind of doctor at work and also at home because you essentially get no break from being a doctor. And it was hard to give all that energy to patients that I didn't really have a connection to and then come home and take what was left and put it into my kid, which is, who has this really substantial problem. And then, the other, there's all kinds of weird aspects to this. I guess to some degree, and then my wife and I both face this when I think having as sick of a child as Andrew, it changes the way you think about other problems that may not be quite as severe. So, when somebody gets an outcome after an eye surgery and they're expecting to be 2010 and instead they're 2020, sometimes, before Andrew, it was kind of easy to listen to those and say, hey, well, I'm sorry this happened and maybe we could do something to improve it. when you have a son or a child that's very sick, sometimes you tend to minimize. I've found myself sometimes minimizing things that I used to take maybe more seriously or let it really bother them. And so I think that I have maybe become a little bit less, not patient, I suppose is probably the wrong word, but I think it's sometimes harder to acknowledge in a way that patients need the seriousness of a problem they see, when I see how much worse and challenging life can get, if that makes any sense. But just perspective changes, right? Your ability to process small concerns is sometimes challenged when you have sick kids like ours, which is not fair to patients. And so I had to go through some career changes to move away from some of the things I was doing and save some of my energy, or I guess preserve more energy for my kids' battle, if you will.
True compassion fatigue, right? And
Yes.
nothing that one can be blamed for and couldn't be any sort of like character flaw whatsoever, especially since you then decided this isn't good for me, my patient, or my family, and then went in a different direction. I think that says a lot about you, actually. And I can only imagine the enormity of both of those worlds colliding. That's a lot to take in.
Yeah, I mean, in my world, I mean, these days what I do mostly is the cosmetic side of plastic surgery. I'm a plastic surgeon, and I've sort of walked away from the reconstruction. And I think it's a strange lifestyle to have to go back and forth between a job that has a lot of levity sometimes to it, where you're making people feel better and more self-confident. But then I walk out of an exam room and get on a phone call with somebody who's giving us some guidance about how to approach the FDA. And all of a sudden we're talking about the mortality rate of this kid, disease my kid has. And so the disparity in the types of hats I'm wearing now it's unlike anything I've ever, it's a weird thing to shift back and forth between these two very different lifestyles or jobs, I suppose, if you will. One's pretty serious. I mean, you have to take them both seriously. That's not to say I would minimize anything I do professionally, but it has a very different feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're like this highly respected, shiny kind of like royalty inside, and then outside you're like a peasant begging for help from anyone and anything.
Yeah. But at the same time, I will say, like, when surgeons become surgeons, in some regard, because we tend to be aggressive personalities who are aggressive problem solvers. And so I would say the way I've always approached industry and research is probably a more aggressive style than others maybe use, because whether it's because I have an MD behind my name or I have a surgeon's personality, but I would say I tend to be very, I guess, gracious about how I do it, but I take a fairly aggressive approach to how I interact with the people in our community in terms of getting stuff done for our kids. So, you learn to beg when you need to, you learn to push when you need to, you learn to intimidate or try to influence people aggressively when you need to, so that they can problem solve for your child in a time frame that's meaningful to the kids who are here today, as opposed to some corporate time frame where, hey, if we solve this in 7 years, that's enough. And the truth is, for us, it's not. You learn to approach each of these, I guess, entities differently so that you can get the most out of them in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, I think that's a super valuable skill set, and I love that. Speaking of meaningful endpoints, what would be one for Andrew and your family?
The thing I focus on every day, I mean, Andrew's gonna be 6 years old next month, and I can't explain the pain of having a son whose voice I've never heard and whose first steps I've never seen. I think that I have a hard time saying that I wouldn't consider it a failure if I don't see him walk or talk or both before I go. It's a really high bar, and maybe it's unrealistic, but I believe in the philosophy of set the bar as high as you can, and if you get halfway there, you've done better than if you set the bar really low and hit that bar. But that's what I want. His seizures aren't as bad as they used to be, so seizure control, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot to my family at this point. He sleeps through the night, which would have felt like a big victory 2 years ago. I'd like to see him go back to picking up his bottle and feeding himself. I would love to hear him say dad or mom or both, and I would love to see him be able to use his feet and arms and legs something like my other two children. So that's what drives me every day. I need to see that. I need it for me. I need it for him. I need it for my wife. And I need it for my other two children who are seeing this brother who every year he gets older and can't do the things that, they do every single day. When he was a baby, when he was 1 year old and wasn't hitting, he wasn't hitting all the appropriate milestones, they didn't understand it because a milestone for a 1 year old is not that dramatic. But as a 6 year old, when they have to explain to their friends who come over that he can't do these things and know kids start asking interesting questions and they're not always delicate in how they ask. I need it for them. So I need it for them too. I want them to see their brother get better. And I need to be able to look at my children's eyes and say, I did everything I could while I was alive to help your little brother. We tried everything possible to give him a better life.
Thanks for sharing that, Justin. Back to kind of your aggressive and amazing skill set that you have as a clinician and being able to get things done. There's actually some really profound things that you've got done in a short amount of time that your team has done. So I'd wonder if you'd speak on, A, how you've connected and partnered with the pharmaceutical companies and created these collaborations with them, with Invitae, and also what was that like finding the association between Fragile X and maybe grabbing onto those coattails to help your community?
So the first, I think, interaction that we had with pharma was with Biogen. So the meeting that Seth set up, I want to say it was 2019 in Baltimore, Biogen, I believe, showed up. I wasn't there, but they showed up. And shortly thereafter, we ended up in a meeting in DC. Immediately before that, I had reached out to Sharon Terry at Genetic Alliance, who's a pretty big figure, I think, in the rare world and has done some amazing things on behalf of her children and for thousands of other families out there. But I'd reached out to her and I said, Sharon, I'm interested in meeting with you. I reached out to her through, I think, LinkedIn and said, I'd like to learn more about what you do. She got back to me 24 hours later, said, I don't check LinkedIn very often, but I just happened to get approached by a pharma company who's looking for a rare disease to tackle. And a few weeks later, we sat down at the table with Genetic Alliance and Luna DNA, Biogen, and Seth and I representing the foundation. And they expressed their interest in taking on KCNT1 with an ASO. It was a really interesting meeting. I think that, what we learned there is that data is really important. They talked about doing a natural history study, which was not a term I was super familiar with at the time. And they proposed this idea for what the architecture of that natural history would look like. And the premise was as many patients as possible. They were looking at trying to recruit, I think at the time, 40 patients were going to go to a single institution located in the upper Northeast in a fairly remote area at a university with one of our big KCNT1 clinicians who we all adore. But they wanted all the patients to fly there. It was going to be, I think, 2 or 3 times in the first year. And so that was the first time we realized how much power we had. So I said, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. Our kids are fragile. They come with a lot of equipment. My son at that point had never been on a plane. And we know just putting him in the car to go to our local hospital often increases his seizure count, dramatically. He's very situationally aware and he gets stressed out easily. And the idea that we're going to take a minimum of 2 flights to go there and be seen in person, seems silly. And let's be honest, when we go see our neurologist with a 1-year-old child, there's not a massive exam that happens. I mean, really, it's more of a conversation. And conversations you don't really need to be present in person for. So they took that information back and they retooled the design for, I think, what was their first fully remote natural history study. So we started that, I think, 2 years ago, but we had remote visits. Nurses came in, EEG techs showed up, phlebotomists showed up, and we did everything either via Zoom or at home studies. So we had 40 patients recruit. We were the fastest group to ever recruit for one of their natural history studies. And I think largely because of this remote design makes it so much more tenable to families with really sick, fragile kids. And I think they're now using that as the model for more natural history studies. So that was kind of cool to influence that. And it was really great that they were, to their credit, they were really receptive to it. I think they were surprised, which I found kind of surprising on my end, that they're going after this disease and putting money into it, but they don't really know what it's like to live with our kids. And that's like a universal truth that I think most of us maybe don't talk about or understand, is that it doesn't matter how famous our clinicians are, it doesn't matter how big the pharma company is. At the end of the day, none of them know the experience of living with a child who has any of our diseases, quite frankly, unless they're one of those rare scientists who went in to solve, the genetic crime that's impacted their own personal child. But, these companies, I think, have good intentions to treat, but they don't really know what it's like. And the truth is, our clinicians, who are often mostly quite lovely people and spend an hour with us every 6 months talking to us about our children, they don't know what it's like to raise that child, because they can ask some questions. You can tell them, oh, the seizure count's up and the kid's not sleeping, but they don't know what it feels like to be a 30 or 40 something year old working parent taking care of these sick kids day and night for year after year after year. So I think all of us have this opportunity to really put that in front of them, to really communicate that. And I think the ways we need to communicate that, it's the FDA. They need to really understand what our kids are going through and what we're going through. I think the drug companies need to understand that. Our clinicians need to really understand that. And so part of it is the rare disease groups, I think maybe responsibility, or at least it's a benefit to us to really make sure we're educating the people who are caring for us and realizing they are not really experts at living with the disease. They can understand it biologically, pharmacologically, but they don't know what it's really like to live with it. So an interesting side note there, we actually found our first company who I was talking about this with the CEO of a biotech company who's developing a device for home EEG monitoring. And I was lamenting the fact that people don't really understand it. And I said, you know what you should do? I said, I invite anyone from your company to come spend 24 hours with me in my house. And he got the brightest look in his eyes. He said, oh my gosh, I will pay my employees to go to your house and anyone else's house so that we can see what that experience is like. And we'll send them a branded sleeping bag and we'll put them up at your place. But they really expressed an interest in getting to really know what it was that we're dealing with, if nothing else, to motivate them at 6 o'clock at night when they've got a little bit more work to do, to fight a little harder for that kid who they spent 24 hours with. They understand a little bit better. So I've been talking for what feels like 10 days. I'll stop talking now. And, if you want to.
No, Justin, everything you're saying is so important and it's so profound. In fact, I think people should rewind for the last 2 minutes and just really remember how important that stuff is. And I also love that they loved that idea. And it makes me wonder, are they just afraid to ask us? Do they think it's inappropriate to ask us? Because the amount of just boring, what you would think data is, but the data that caregivers have, that patients have, of what it's actually like, of what the symptoms are, of how it looks to take a bath, to get your kid in and out of a bath, all of these things that can take hours just to get done, that you have to do every day to get through the day, while, like you said, having a job, having other kids, being a friend, being a partner, whatever. There's so much that goes into it that you can't ever explain to anyone unless they live it or they really, really see it.
Yeah. And I think when you start to think about really important things, like what are the endpoints that you want with a new therapy, right? So the obvious one that everybody jumps on with a disease like KCNT1, and I suspect most diseases where epilepsy is one of the defining characteristics, is, let's reduce the seizure count. And that's great, except all of us, after you've seen over 10,000 seizures, develop a pretty high level of comfort with it. It bothers us, but it doesn't faze us the same way as it did when we saw our first 500. And so when we say things like, hey, I'd like to be able to, if our endpoint was sleeping through the night, that would be huge. Or if my endpoint was my child could swallow or, could pick up his bottle and drink. And when they hear that, it doesn't resonate. But if you came to my house and saw how many hours a day it takes for us to feed a half a cc at a time through a syringe into my son's mouth, because to this point we've still refused to do a G-tube because it was just one of the lines we drew where we said we don't want to do that for him. But if they saw how much effort goes into doing that and how much time it takes, all of a sudden that might resonate more as a legit endpoint. And I suspect with the FDA too. But seizures are medical; they can quantify that. There's a count for it. Some of these other things are harder to quantify and it's harder for people to understand, but they can be maybe just as important, if not more so, than some of the really obvious endpoints that we tend to gravitate towards. And that's where I think going back to just selling our story. And then I think that ties into, we make all these efforts, we have all these initiatives to gather data, right? Whether it's through surveys, through our registries, or these more informal surveys, parents taking the time to really share on an individual level what stresses them out. That information is really important. And yeah, it takes time to sit down and answer surveys, and inevitably you're going to get survey questions where you think, okay, this is so not relevant to my child, but we'd like to think that we build surveys where at least half the questions can be relevant. But the information that comes out of that is valuable because we can take it and go to the FDA and say, look, it's not seizures. 60% of our parents are really mostly focused on getting a better sleep at night, because when you're not sleeping, you can't function for your sick child and you can't function for your neurotypical children. And let's be honest, not sleeping, it's one of the most common forms of torture around the world. So it's a pretty big endpoint that I suspect probably isn't taken this seriously at regulatory bodies or by maybe pharma companies, because better sleep just it doesn't seem like a really dramatic thing to influence. But if there was a seizure drug or a drug developed for my child or for our community where the only thing it did was improve sleep by 75%, that would be huge for us.
Yeah, it's like the number one torture tool, lack of sleep. Like, it's real.
Yeah.
First of all, that makes me shudder thinking back to the day just for myself in feeding Ford before he got a G-tube. Ugh. But I do want to go back to talking about families filling out surveys. I think most of us know how difficult it is to engage the majority of your patient community, right? And that's for so many reasons. You know, not everyone's necessarily on social media scrolling when they get the call to action. Another one is because, hey, they're not sleeping and they have other kids. Maybe they're a single parent. Maybe they don't have all kinds of resources that others do, or maybe they're just really stressed. But maybe they also just don't know how valuable they are. You know, maybe they don't think they have anything to contribute. And so they kind of just tuck away in the shadows because they feel less than or inadequate. And could you just maybe give a really great dad doctor pep talk to the people who think that way and to let them know how valuable it is when they do contribute, when they do share their story, when they at least share content that you're speaking about to help your community, and just filling out those surveys, even if they have to take it in little bits or maybe even need someone on the other end of the phone helping them, coach them through it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll draw on a conversation I had just an hour or two before we're having this conversation. So we were on the phone today with somebody about a drug company that wants to go to the FDA, and we're trying to figure out the best way to present it. And we were talking about what is the FDA really interested in? And the first thing she said is, what is the patient and family experience with this ultra rare disease that none of us know anything about? And so we have to communicate that story. And everybody's story, there's some themes, like some of us there's probably 80% of what we experience is the same from family to family. So I can share my experience and that nails most of it. But then there's parts that are unique to each family, and everyone's perspective on these problems is going to be a little bit different. So I guess what I'm getting to is, this is one of the few ways that families can truly directly advocate for their patient, their child, and for themselves, because you're treating, and I think of these diseases, you're not just treating the patient, it's treating everybody around you because it has such a profound impact on the whole family. But this is where we can do it. Most of us aren't going to go open up a lab space and develop a drug. You know, there's certain elements that we just have to put the faith in other people to do. But this is a huge way, if not and maybe the only way that most of us will really have a chance to contribute. That is to fill out surveys. When we ask questions, what is the most important thing to you? Would you participate in a trial if it was a small molecule? Would you participate if it was a gene therapy tool? Answering those questions gives us really key information so that the government bodies like the FDA can say, okay, this is a desperate group of patients. Here are the 10 things that they're overwhelmed by. And 80% of them have been surveyed and said that they would do a trial if one was to become available. In our community, we had an N of 1 trial and we lost a patient. I mean, you couldn't imagine a worse outcome. And yet our families are still interested in trials. And the FDA, if we don't ask them those questions, we don't know the answer. And if we don't present that to the FDA, they don't know. So one version is the FDA might say, in the absence of us talking to them and filling out surveys, they could easily make the conclusion that these families are unlikely to ever participate in a future trial because of what happened in their first one. What we need is data to go back and say, well, our kids are severely sick. Even without a trial, we lose up to 20%, by the age of 5. So every month or two, we get another posting on social media where a child has been lost. And so, yes, drug trials are risky, but it's also risky just having this disease. And we're still interested in trials despite, what's happened. So if we don't ask, the foundation's responsibility is to create these surveys with our partners, to ask our community, and the community's responsibility is to set aside that 5, 10, or 20 minutes answering those questions as best they can so that we have that information to go back and influence decision-making around trials. Drug companies have to be interested and know that if they develop a drug that will try it. The FDA has to know that if a drug is made by a pharma company that the patients will try it. But if they have no evidence that the community is interested and engaged in that process, one or both of those parties shuts down the whole thing. And all of a sudden we're stuck with the same thing we've had since 2012 or 13 when this was originally diagnosed, which is essentially no treatment. And in the absence of treatment, what all of us have to look forward to is a lifetime of pain and suffering. Right now I'm at an age where I can still take, my wife and I can still take pretty good care of our son. But to me, the most, I think, scary future is us being in our 70s and having, a son who's now a full grown adult who can't do anything for himself, whose voice we've never heard, who can't put his feet down to help us with transfers. And we're going to physically be unable to take care of him. And the idea of putting my son in a facility is unacceptable, which means that where does that responsibility fall on? Or when we pass, is it going to be our kids taking care of this child who can't do anything for himself? So, spending the time now to contribute that data has the potential to save us all a little bit, or either to get ourselves a better future, to save our children's lives, and to get a better life for our other children and for ourselves. So I think it's imperative. It is the biggest gift that any of our parents can give their sick child, their healthy children, or themselves or our community, is to fill out that information when we ask.
So well said, Justin. Thank you so much. And it reminds me of something Mike Graglia, of course, said once that really shines back with that is, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. Kind of like your example about the sweet baby that was lost a few months ago. Anyone else in industry is going to be like, oh, well, let's not touch that anymore. That's what happens. And they're definitely going to be away from that. No, they're not. No, they're not. Those families want to be with their kids and they want to help save their kids and the kids that come after them. So keep telling them what you want and keep fighting and keep telling your story and keep filling out the surveys and doing anything that you can, even if it's small, because it will make a difference, because silence is not the answer.
Exactly.
I know I'm taking up so much of your time, but I did want to kind of circle back to the Fragile X thing, because I know for my community, we're dealing with some serious gatekeeping with the CP community, because I'm sure they just don't want to lose their beautiful funding that they have. But it's also just such a route that we need to take to get more patients diagnosed. And I know you guys had some sort of connection with the Fragile X community. And I've wondered, how has that been going? And do you see a future with like kind of partnering there and getting more help?
It's a really good question. And I'm not sure that we've really figured out the right way to approach it. I think part of the issue is really trying to define, is there truly a connection or not? So we have at least one researcher who's been studying KCNT1 for a very long time, suggesting that there is this interplay between KCNT1 and Fragile X. And I think that, what got us interested about that was just the very nature of trying to understand a disease like KCNT1 being ultra rare. We only have 400 documented cases in the world. The prevalence model shows that there's quite a few, there's likely thousands. But, how do you explain why so many different pharma teams are working on KCNT1? And so the thought was, well, maybe it is this connection to Fragile X, which affects more like 1 million patients around the world. We've had interactions with Fraxa and some of the leadership there about, the potential of working together. But I think if we had really solid, irrefutable scientific data that showed a connection, I think it would be it would help us drive that, I think, a little bit further. I think that the way we've kind of, I guess, taken that information and used it to the extent that you use information is kind of explaining the impact statement for donors. So when we ask people to help us to fund the research and drug discovery efforts that aren't fully funded independently, people say, okay, well, I'm doing this to help 100 kids in the United States, maybe 400 kids worldwide. And that's a really lovely thing to do, even if it's one child. But when we talk to them, we say, well, number one, yes, it's those 400 kids, but we also have 3 prevalence models, which suggest it's more like 2,500 kids in the US and maybe 35,000 worldwide. And then beyond that, it is possible that in the course of addressing KCNT1 and potentially finding treatments or cures for it, that it might indirectly or directly either benefit children with Fragile X or give insights that make it easier to eventually treat Fragile X. So that's kind of the extent to which we've sort of, I guess, used that information. And we try to be very cautious about that, because it's not 100% clear. And I'm not sure the entire scientific community says, yes, there's a clear link here and solving one's going to fix the other. There's maybe some signals there. But I think we use it more with regards to like the impact statement for funding.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But definitely take that glimmer if it's there for sure.
Yeah.
Because like you said, that impact statement's huge and it does help other people kind of on board with a more like safer sense of security.
Sure. Absolutely.
All right, Justin, is there anything that I didn't ask you today that I should have, or anything else that you want to leave our friends listening with?
Yeah, I would say, some of the stuff we talked about is really dark, but the fact is this is probably the single best time to be a patient or a family member associated with KCNT1. When Andrew was diagnosed, the overwhelming awful feeling centered around this concept that Andrew was just born too early for this disease, that there was nothing at the time. Now we didn't have a single drug that was even close to being used at that time. Now, fast forward a few years, we've had our first N of 1 trial. We have around a dozen programs around the world that are actively engaged in developing therapeutics for KCNT1. And so I think that's very exciting. I think as tragic as the outcome was that we saw at Boston Children's, if there was something positive there, and it is massively positive, it is that the seizures went away for those children. And one of the parents that I'm close with shared that the child started to wake up and do things that she had never done before, to make eye contact after basically scanning her whole life. And they saw these fairly, unequivocal changes in her. She just wasn't on the drug long enough, I think, to see where that was going to go. But the bottom line is that tells us that this phenotype, this disease you can improve it and potentially reverse it. And I think and potentially eliminate it. And that's amazing. That is what keeps me going after several years of being fairly exhausted by having, a full-time job and working through the foundation. It's this hopeful message that, after all these years, we've shown both in the lab, in animal models, and now in patients that this disease can be improved. And I think it can be improved substantially. So the parents who have older children, I think that, there's evidence that even in older kids, you can improve this. For the kids who are just born, I think there's tremendous hope to substantially change the outcome of this disease for those children in particular. And the ones born 5 years from now, I think are never going to have, a single consequence of the genetic disorder. So it's a really hopeful time. We have more going on now than I ever thought possible. Now we just need to kind of continue to help get the community ready for these trials. And I think we're doing a pretty good job doing that. So I feel really hopeful for our families and for our patients that we're going to see big improvements in the individual lives of our patients and families really in the next, within the next 1 to 2 years. I think we're going to start to see these really positive messages and stories come out.
Yes. I'm just thinking that was I'm so glad that family had a meaningful, literal meaningful endpoint.
Yeah.
And you're doing such an amazing job, all of you over there. And I know how hard you're working, and you're right. There's absolute tremendous hope, and it's very exciting. So good job, and keep it up. And thanks, Justin. You're helping us all, like everyone is who's doing this kind of work. So thanks for joining me today.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the chance to do it and, talk to your audience and talk to you. And I look forward to seeing you at the next rare thing that we do together.
Likewise.
Okay, take care.
I hope you've been enjoying this podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this show with your people, and please make sure to rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also head over to Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to connect with me and stay updated on the show. If you're interested in sharing your story, or if you have anything you would like to contribute, please submit it to my website at effieparks.com. Thank you so much for listening to the show and for supporting me along the way. I appreciate you all so much. I don't know what kind of day you're having, but if you need a little pick-me-up, Ford's got you.